Welcome to Topic 6 of the skeletal structure, the pectoral and pelvic girdle and the bones of the upper and lower limbs. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the learning targets for this topic. 3E. We will start with the pectoral girdle. Pectoral is for shoulder, and girdle is something that supports limbs. So this is part of the appendicular skeleton that will hold the upper limbs. You can see that it begins with the clavicle. The clavicle braces the scapula. It's an attachment for muscles. That will lead to the scapula. The scapula starts with the acromion process, and that will lead into the spine of the scapula. Then we have the coracoid process, not to be confused with the coronoid process of the ulna or the mandible. Notice the A is underlined so that you can recognize the difference. There is also a glenoid fossa. Remember, a fossa means that it is going to be an indent. Here is another view of the scapula. Scap means to break loose or escape. So therefore you can remember it is part of the appendicular skeleton. You can see the acromion process is at the top. It comes from the word acros, which means highest. So you can see it is a protrusion that is at the highest point. Below that comes the coracoid process. The word cora comes from corax, which is a raven or a crow. And then we get the end of the word, eidos, which means shape or form. So the coracoid process was thought to look like a crow or a raven's beak. Here's the spine of a scapula. You can feel this protruding from your back at times. Here is the glenoid cavity. It is an attachment place. It is a joint for where your humor, the head of the humerus, will sit. Notice there are other features to the scapula. It is a very detailed structure. We have a superior border with a scapular notch. There is a supraspinous fossa, an intraspinous fossa, and there is a medial border. This is the posterior surface that you are looking at, or the back view. Here's a side view, so that is our lateral view. The glenoid fossa of the scapula and the head of the humerus will articulate with one another, so the scapula will lead into the humerus. You can see we have two views of the humerus. Here's the posterior surface, and this is the anterior surface. You can see after the head we have a greater tubercle and a lesser tubercle with an intertubercle groove. The greater and lesser tubercles are attachment sites for muscle. You can also see the head will lead into the neck, just like our head would lead into our neck. And here is also called the surgical neck. On the posterior surface, you will see an olecranon fossa. Remember, a fossa is going to be an indent. Olecranon stands for elbow. The epicondyles will provide an attachment for muscles and ligaments. The condyles are rounded surfaces of bone that allow movement from a joint. The capitulum is the lateral portion, and the trochlea is the medial portion. The Greek word for trochlea came from trochelia, which is a pulley. Capitulum has the word capit in it, which means little head. Humerus will lead to the radius and the ulna. You can see at the top of the ulna we have an olecranon process, the trochlear notch, and a coronoid process. At the bottom portion, or the distal portion, we have the head of the ulna, a styloid. Do not confuse this styloid process with the one in the temporal bone. The word stylo stylus is an instrument for writing, and eidos is shape or form. So this means that it has a pen or pencil-like structure. Remember, oleon meant elbow, so this olacron process will create our elbow. The radius has a head of the radius and a radial tuberosity. At the end, this also has a styloid process. In this case, notice we have a coronoid process. C-O-R-O-N-O-I-D. The word coronoid comes from crone, which means a crown. Eidos means shape. So this shape is like a crown. The radius and the ulna will lead us to the bones of the hand. Notice there are many bones within our hand. The hand bones are numbered 1 through 5, 1 being the thumb and 5 being the pinky. Since the carpals are the most proximal structure to the radius and ulna, we're going to begin there. The carpals are the wrist bone. The word carp comes from the Greek meaning karpos, which means wrist. The carpals will lead into the metacarpals. These are within your palm when you are looking at your hand. Meta means near, after, behind, or beside. Phalanges. Phalanges are your fingers. You have proximal phalanges, middle phalanges, and distal phalanges, except the thumb. The thumb only has 2 phalanges. They only will have the proximal and the distal. There is no middle phalange for the thumb. The word phalange comes from the Greek word phalanx, which means from the line of battle or finger bone. Here are the carpals, followed by the metacarpals, followed by the phalanges. Here is the distal portion of the phalanges, the middle portion of the phalanges, and the proximal portion of the phalanges. If we are looking at this bone, this would be the first proximal phalange. If we were looking at this bone here, this would be the second middle phalange. If we were looking at this bone here, this would be the 5th distal phalange. In order to help you remember the carpals, we've come up with a mnemonic device. Students, notice. In order to help you remember the carpals, we have come up with a mnemonic device. Students love taking practicals to test cranial health. The S will begin with the proximal phalange by the first digit. So it would be students love taking practicals. Go back to the first phalange. Now we're going to the more distal portion. To test. What does each letter stand for? The S stands for scaphoid. The L stands for lunate. The C stands for triquetral, and the P stands for the pisiform. Now we're going to start back up here. The E How will this mnemonic device help? The beginning letter will stand for each letter of the carpals. We'll start with the distal row. How will this mnemonic device help? Each letter stands for the carpal. How will this mnemonic device help? Each letter stands for one of the carpals. We will start with the most proximal row, starting by the first phalange. You will notice that students is S, and that stands for scaphoid, followed by lunate, followed by the triquetral, with the tiny bone, the pisiform. We will now go to the more distal row, starting once again by the first phalange. This one begins with a T and this one will be the trapezium, followed by the trapezoid. Then we have the capitate, and least but not last, it's the hamate. Some interesting information about the carpals that may help you remember them is that the scaphoid is the most commonly fractured bone in the carpus. The lunate is the most frequently dislocated carpal bone. The triquetral bone, C, is also called the triquetrum bone. It is a pyramidal bone, three-cornered, and it's creating a triangular shape. If you look, the pisiform D is pretty tiny. It derives from the Latin pisum, which means pea. Starting again by digit number 1, we have E, which is a trapezium. This derives from the Greek word trapezon, which means irregular quadrilateral. Literally, it means a little table. F is a trapezoid. It is the smallest bone in the distal row. G is the shape. It comes from the Latin word capitis, or having a head. The last but not least is the hamate. This is most commonly fractured when an amateur golfer hits the ground hard with his golf club on the downswing. It can also sometimes be fractured in baseball by a checked swing. Fun fact, there is a number of professional baseball players that have had the bone removed during the course of their career. The word hamate comes from the Latin hamatus, which means hooked. If you look at the hamate bone, it does have a little hook on it, so that can help you remember it. Now that we have finished the upper limbs, we're going to look at the lower limbs beginning with the pelvic girdle. That is where all the other appendages will hang from. Remember, the pelvic girdle itself is also part of the appendicular skeleton. The pelvic bone will begin with the coxal bone, which is really made up of 3 different parts. The coxal bone is made up of the ilium, which is the largest and uppermost portion of the coxal bone. It also has a portion from the pubis, which is the most anterior portion over here, followed by the ischium. The ischium is the lowest portion and it will move posteriorly. You can see over here it makes a little loop. In this picture you can see the acetabulum. The acetabulum is the joint for which the femur head will sit into. The word acetabulum means little vinegar cup. It was a Latin word for a small vessel that would store vinegar. Remember, the real word for vinegar is acetic acid. Therefore, acetabulum comes from acetic acid. The pelvic girdle has many parts. Remember, the 3 parts of the coxal bone are the ilium, the pubis, and the ischium. You can also see that the sacrum sits within the pelvis, which you cannot see in this picture, but you may see in this picture, the coccyx. Here's the pubic symphysis, or the symphysis pubicis. The obturator foramen is the hole within the ischium and the pubic bone. You can see that the acetabulum leads into the femur. Here is another view of the coxal bones. Male and female pelvises have many differences. Thus, the pelvis can be used to help identify gender. Look at the 2 structures, male versus the female. Overall, you may notice that the male pelvis appears narrower, and taller. The female's is a little bit shallower and broader. If you look at the obturator foramen, you will notice in the female that is much rounder and more oval in shape, whereas the male's is steeper. You can see the pubic arch in the male has a much steeper V shape, where the female's is wider. The acetabulum led to the head of the femur. The head of the femur will lead into the neck. From the neck, we can see a greater trochanter and a lesser trochanter. The word trochanter comes from the Greek word for a runner. The greater trochanter is an attachment of muscle that will stabilize the hip during one-legged balance, whether in standing or in bipedal locomotion. The lesser trochanter is an attachment for muscles that flex the thigh. That will lead to the greater tubercle, which will lead to this line called the linea aspera. You can see that the medial surface will have medial epicondyles, very similar to the humerus. There are also lateral epicondyles. On the posterior side, you will see an intercondylar fossa. On the anterior surface, you will see a patellar surface. This patellar surface will articulate with the knee bone, the patella. The femur will lead us to the tibia and the fibula. The tibia is a slightly larger, wider bone of the two. Perhaps you think it looks somewhat like a T. The tibia has a lateral condyle, an intercondyle eminence, which sticks up, a medial condyle. You can see this tibia tuberosity. It has an anterior crest that you may feel if you run your hand along your tibia. It also has a medial malleus. It is the medial portion. Malleus comes from the word hammer, but it's a mystery as to why it's called that. Here is the head of the fibula, and we have the lateral malleus on the fibula side, which will make up your ankle bone. Tibia will articulate with the talus. The word tal comes from the word talon, or heel, spur, or ankle. The word calcaneus, which is our heel, comes from the word calcar, which means spur, heel, or foot. Notice the calcaneus, the navicular, and the medial cuneiform make up a set of bones that we can call the tarsus. You may notice that just like we had metacarpals, we have metatarsals. Not carpals, but with a T, tarsals. Tarsals, which is very similar to the word metacarpals. However, it is with a T, tarsals. We will go from the medial portion to the lateral. So medially, it will go 1, and then it will be 2, 3, 4, 5, going to the lateral portion. The medial portion will lead to our big toe. Just as we had phalanges of the hand, notice we have phalanges in our foot. The phalanges are named the same way as they were in the hand. They will be proximal, medial, and distal. Notice the big toe has a proximal and a distal. It is also numbered the same way. Starting with the big toe, which is the most medial portion, it will go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, leading to your pinky toe. Just to highlight, you can see the talus and the calcaneus. This ends topic 6. Happy studying!